Good afternoon, and thank you for joining us. I'm Lynn Weil, Director of External Affairs for the Center for Security and Emerging Technology, or CSET, at Georgetown University. And we're delighted to welcome you for a discussion of our recently published report on investments in artificial intelligence. A link to that report is on our website on the event page, and it was included in the invitation for this event. So you're welcome to follow along there one way or another, especially when we get to audience Q&A. But in a moment, you're going to hear from our featured speaker himself and our moderator. First, a brief bit of housekeeping. All attendees' microphones are muted, and if you're joining us by computer, we cannot see you. If you're on a computer and experience any technical issues, use the chat function at the bottom of the screen, and a CSET team member will try to help you out. Don't use the chat just yet for anything else. We will come back to it in a bit. And now it is my pleasure to hand the reins over to our moderator, who will introduce our speaker, Zachary Arnold. Dr. Sarah Sewell is Executive Vice President for Policy at In-Q-Tel. She has served as Undersecretary of State for Civilian Security, Democracy, and Human Rights, was a member of the Defense Policy Board under Secretaries Gates and Hagel, and was the inaugural Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense for Peacekeeping. For more than a decade, Dr. Sewell served on the faculty at the Harvard Kennedy School, where she directed the Carr Center and worked closely with the US military on civilian protection. She is currently on the board of the Center for Naval Analyses and Creative Associates, and a senior fellow at Harvard's Belfer Center for Science and International Affairs. Sarah, over to you.
Thank you, Lynn, and it's wonderful to be here with everyone. I'm delighted to join CSET for this program, and welcome to everyone who's joined us online. I have the pleasure of introducing our speaker, Zachary Arnold. Zach is a research fellow at CSET, and he focuses on investment flows and workforce trends. His writing has been published in the Wall Street Journal, the MIT Technology Review, Defense One, and leading law journals. Before joining CSET, Zach was an associate at Latham & Watkins. He was a judicial clerk on the US Court of Appeals for the Fifth Circuit, and he was a researcher and producer of documentary films. He received a JD from Yale Law School and an AB in Social Studies from Harvard University. And with that, Zach, over to you.
Great. Thanks, Sarah. Thanks so much for that generous introduction. And thanks to everyone who's joined for your interest in CSET's research. It's exciting to be able to present to so many people about work that's been a long time coming. All right. So again, thanks so much for joining. I'm going to present on what investment trends can tell us about AI's present and future, building on some recent work that we've been doing at CSET. And first and foremost, I want to thank these folks, CSET's Brain Trust, on this and other projects related to financial investment. We've spent a good deal of time examining investment related to AI, examining money flowing into and out of the private sector. And one reasonable question would be, why? Why do this? CSET isn't an economic policy think tank. We focus on national security. Why focus on the capital markets in our work? The clearest answer I know for this comes from former Secretary of Defense Ash Carter. He gave an interview a few years ago in which he said, we aren't what we were in the 50s and 60s and 70s when I started. In those days, all technology of consequence came from the United States and came from within the walls of government. Those days are irrevocably lost. Now I've got to go outside the Pentagon no matter what. This may be overstating the case a little bit. There are obviously certain areas in technology where the government is still the prime customer and holds a lot of sway. But to a great extent, this is true. Commercially developed multi-use technologies like artificial intelligence are now central to national security. This is not just a shift facing the Pentagon. This isn't a quirk of the American sort of laissez-faire way of doing business. Here, for example, we have the view from China. So on the left, the year is 1958. Chairman Mao is taking the time to inspect a state-owned auto factory. And on the right, we have the 2016 equivalent. This is Chairman Xi. He's making a similar inspection, but this time he's inspecting an AI-enabled robot developed by iFlyTech, which is a for-profit private sector Chinese company. Of course, private sector, public sector distinctions become a little bit flexible in China. But there is a meaningful private element here. iFlyTech's owners do include Chinese state entities, but at the same time, it's a publicly traded company. They have shareholders from around the world, your BlackRock, Vanguard, and so forth. So in some sense, whether it's in the US or in China, this is the story of the shift in national security from bullets to bits. IT is a defining technology for national defense, but obviously not only in that domain, it's also the defining technology in the civilian economy. And that means that much of the progress in IT, including in AI, is going to be driven by for-profit actors, not primarily motivated by national security, or for that matter, by government needs in general. And much national security technology will be adapted from civilian technology, like in the Samsung ad we see here for the Galaxy military edition. So the private sector is in many cases holding the reins. This, of course, isn't to say that public policy, that government action aren't relevant. Quite the opposite. Even in a private sector-led strategy, the federal government's choices on R&D policy, investment controls, export controls, trade policy, and on and on and on, could spell the difference between growth and stagnation for the US AI sector in the coming years. So policy is going to play a big role, even in a technological domain driven by the private sector. And smart policy really starts with situational awareness. If they're going to make decisions that shape the private sector's AI future and in turn America's AI future, and to be clear, policymakers are already making those decisions, they need to understand where commercial AI activity is taking place, who's carrying it out, what purposes people are trying to serve, and how all of this is changing over time, as it is, very rapidly. So enter CSET. We try to support that sort of situational awareness in the policy community. And so about a year ago, we started tracking AI private sector activity. And we did this specifically by following the lifeblood of that activity, which is capital, financial investment flows. What we've done is we've compiled a very large data set of companies and deals that we've sourced from some of the leading market intelligence providers, Crunchbase and Refinitiv, formerly Thomson Reuters. And then Ilya Rakovsky and the CSET data science team have parsed and cleaned and sorted and pushed and pulled all of our data. And what we've ended up with is what we think is a pretty good picture of the market. At the outset, it's important to note we're focused on AI-related companies when we're talking about investment into AI. And we've defined these companies with our own methodology. It's based on business descriptions in these commercial data sets, and it's validated against expert compiled lists of sort of artificial intelligence leaders. I'm glad to get more into the details of the methodology in the Q&A. For now, I'll just say this isn't a perfect method, but we think it returns meaningful results, and it's as good or better as anything else that's out there, at least that we've seen. But that said, it's important to be clear what we're measuring in this report and what we're leaving out before I dive into our findings. So what we're doing here is we're now analyzing equity investment into privately held AI companies, which we're defining as for-profit businesses that are focused on AI and not traded on a stock exchange. So that's excluding the big tech players, Alphabet, Alibaba, and so forth, diversified public companies of that sort. It's focused on startups, on the sorts of privately held companies that would be considered mergers and acquisitions targets, private equity, and so forth. And notably, we are including state-owned enterprises unless they're traded on a public exchange. So again, to be very clear, we're capturing a slice of the overall AI ecosystem, that AI investment market. It's just a slice, but we think it's a very meaningful slice. Most AI companies that are out there are privately held. Startups, which in many ways are the keystone of the AI ecosystem, are by definition privately held companies, right? They haven't IPO'd. And we can gather a lot of information about them through the approach that we've taken here. And that's useful, both for understanding what's going on with individual companies, but also for gaining insight into AI competitiveness at a national level. So countries with active private markets have higher growth, attract more businesses, especially early stage businesses, and those companies are better resourced, more likely to innovate and succeed. So again, we think by examining this slice of the market, we can draw some meaningful insights about AI competition in the grander sense. So in the rest of this presentation, I'd like to go into the findings from our paper, and I'll do this in 3 phases. First, where we are. So what the state of play was as of very recently. Our findings date to earlier this year, and the trends that led there. Next, where we're headed. So what do our findings suggest we're going to see in the markets developing in the next few years and the implications for national competition? And last, what to do. So what do our findings suggest for a broader US AI strategy, not just related to investment, but technology as a whole? And at this point, I'll be going a little more off the world as it is now, not focused on policy recommendations. We are trying to understand the state of play, but fortunately, my colleagues at CSET have been working on a variety of related policy issues, and I'll be drawing on their work once we get there. So first, where we're headed. I'd like to make 4 basic points. First, the US is still in the lead when it comes to private market investment. Second, China's rise in the private markets, while real, has often been misunderstood and overestimated, frankly. Third, the private sector, the sort of private companies we're looking at, are not necessarily oriented toward the needs that government has. They're serving a different set of clients, and we see that reflected in the sorts of applications that are attracting investment. And fourth and finally, Chinese investors, investors from China investing in AI companies anywhere in the world are actually mostly investing in China, right? They're a small section of the investment community in the US and getting smaller. So first, America in the lead. So by our estimates, America is leading a very quickly growing global market. So this graphic on this slide shows disclosed transaction value by the target country, right? So on the left, we see the amount of money per year that US AI companies are raising from investors. And we think it's about $26 billion as of 2019. That's about 2/3 of the global total, which we think is about 40 billion according to this metric. Again, this is based on the target country receiving investment. And we're going by headquarters location to sort companies into countries, which is important to note. We're not looking at sort of corporate ownership. If there's shell companies, we're not trying to get into all those shells. We're looking at where those companies are based. Again, this is an approach that yields estimates necessarily, but we validate it and we think the results are meaningful here. That said, in many AI investment transactions, the parties, for whatever reason, never publicly reveal their deal amount. They don't say how much money changed hands in the deal. So we use 2 other metrics, investment count and estimated total value, to give a clearer view of the market as a whole. And so the first metric here, transaction count, so the number of investments, venture capital rounds, merger transactions, sorted by the country of the target for those transactions. And again, we see the US in the lead, although the countries other than the US and China are performing more or less at the same level. Some slight dips into 2019. We're not sure if those will continue. China growing steadily, but from a very small base of deals. So we're starting to see more AI investment transactions into Chinese private market companies. Those deals are actually becoming smaller, given that the overall disclosed transaction value is declining. And finally, estimated transaction value. So what we did here is we tried to, for those deals whose transaction amounts weren't disclosed, as I discussed earlier, we tried to estimate what those deal values might be using median values from similar deals, basically. These are very rough estimates, obviously, but our best sense is that AI investment volume is significantly higher than disclosed values would imply globally, rather than about 40 according to those disclosed value totals. And again, this analysis again favors the US. You can see on the left, approaching $50 billion. In large part due to the very active mergers and acquisition market in the US, which those deals tend to be higher in value. You're buying the whole company. So this is not to say, the US is in the lead. This is not to say that China isn't progressing in AI over this period. They clearly are. But we don't see sort of clear, unequivocal evidence of that rise in private market investment trends. So one way to see this a little more clearly is to normalize the data. So the chart on this slide is showing trends across our three investment metrics, looking as if 2015 is your baseline. 2015 is 100%. And you can see China's reddish line and the value counts sort of peaking very rapidly and then declining very rapidly, such that in 2019, by some of these metrics, they basically ended up near where they started out in that five-year period. This is a striking trend. People naturally wonder why. Why the boom and bust? I think there's a few things going on here. First is sort of just general macroeconomic headwinds in China, transactions affecting the entire Chinese market, especially the relatively risky, relatively less mature venture capital market. For AI specifically, we also kind of see inflated expectations, the hype cycle kind of crashing into reality, an overheated market cooling down as companies that have exciting technology may sort of struggle how to understand how to turn that into money. And similarly, earlier investments coming into disappointing results that sort of cool the market as a whole, especially relative to those kind of sky-high expectations. So again, China's AI development is evident and indisputable in a lot of other areas, in publications, high-quality scholarship, patenting, certainly. But the trends in this slice of the AI competition suggest, possible headwinds to China's overall AI development, which again will rely on the private sector to a significant extent. And this is something we see in our data, but not just in our data. So we see this in broader trends in the Chinese capital markets. And what we see looking at Chinese language sources, this is one of my favorites from 36KR, which is an influential sort of tech investment portal, reporting, I think it was last year, that investors are escaping artificial intelligence, right? This sort of skepticism you'll come across fairly quickly looking in Chinese language sources. Some of that nuance can get lost on the way into English. Third point I want to make on the current state of play is that the government's needs are not the private market's priorities. In other words, few AI startups, especially startups, privately held companies in general, seem to be working and raising funds with public sector clients squarely in mind. And this is especially true outside of China. So the chart on this slide is based on our own categorization schema. So we've annotated each company in our data set with the category of applications that they seem to focus on, again, based on publicly available information about these companies. And we see that when we're looking at where these companies narrowly focus, very few startups and privately held companies focus explicitly on government needs, public safety needs, military needs. The share gets a lot larger when you throw in biometrics and security, which are obviously very relevant to government use and often used by governments. But still, we don't see that a lot of these companies are focused, a lot of the companies that are attracting investment are focused on government needs, at least as far as we can tell in public. Now that's kind of a narrow analysis, right? It's true that a larger share of AI companies are building products that could be used by government or could be marketed to government as well as others, but aren't, they're not government-focused startups. So on the chart in this slide, we're grouping together the companies in application areas that are more likely to be useful for the government. So maybe things like transportation or sort of administrative functions, general purpose applications and hardware. And we see, the proportions go up a bunch, especially in China. We see more of these sorts of potentially government relevant AI companies. But there's a lot of uncertainty here, right? In general, the government can be a tricky client to work for. When the government is one potential client among many, it's not clear how much adaptation of commercial technology for government needs, especially in relatively unusual or less sort of overlapping government needs, how much of that adaptation will actually happen, whether those public needs are going to be fully met. That's certainly true in the United States, where compared to China, the public sector plays a much smaller role in the overall economy. Fourth and finally, on the current state of play, Chinese investors in AI companies mostly seem to invest at home. They're mostly investing in China-based AI companies. This is really important. There's a lot of concern about Chinese investors sort of using the American capital markets and venture capital and whatever else as an instrument of technology transfer, especially technology transfer for strategic tools like AI. And what we see is that this, there's some amount of this activity happening, no doubt, but as best as we can tell, not enough to affect the aggregate trends, where we see that, the clear majority, especially by 2019, of the number of transactions that involved Chinese investor participants are directed into Chinese AI. There are individual transactions from a tech transfer perspective that are concerning, no doubt. But in the aggregate, these investors are a relatively small piece of a larger and much more diverse AI investment market outside China. And I'll come back to this in a little bit. But first, I want to talk about the findings in our research that point toward the future, toward where we might be going in the next 5-10 years. And I want to highlight two in particular. First is this multipolarity. So we expect a diversifying, truly global AI market to continue to emerge in the next several years. And much of the fastest growth and most dynamic activity is going to be occurring in the so-called rest of the world, right? So not the US and not China. And at the same time, we're going to see the continued sort of unhitching of Chinese investment from the US AI market, going what was a small but meaningful presence in the aggregate to relatively little involvement at all. So first, looking at sort of where AI dynamism is emerging around the world is certainly not unipolar. So this chart shows the share of the global AI investment market that's being captured by US-based AI companies. And we see that, it's about 60% more or less in value. That's gone up and down a little bit, but more stable. And a steadily declining US share of investment events, deal count, such that now most AI investment transactions, at least that we're able to track, are taking place outside the United States, right, into companies that are based, whether it's China or Europe or East Asia or wherever else. So the US has no monopoly on AI startup activity, clearly. But not globally dominant, right? Not the sole or even the overwhelming destination for AI capital. So does that mean we have a bipolar world, right? So is it that China's just picking up the slack from the US? Again, not quite. China is definitely part of that story, but this is increasingly about our normalized view. And if you look at the green line, that's the share of our metrics accounted for by countries other than the US and China, Western Europe, Asia, and so forth. And we see the rest of the world is outpacing the US. It's outpacing China also, except by transaction account. But again, remember, China's growing from that very small baseline. We shouldn't overstate these trends, right? The US and China are still, the biggest players by far, but the trends are pointing in a clear direction. This is also true at the individual country level. We see hubs for AI investment developing in all sorts of countries. Disclosed value is, of our three metrics, probably the one that's most striking. And we see just massive growth in countries like Israel, Western Europe, Canada, India, Japan, and so forth. All of these growing significantly faster than China and the US, with only a couple exceptions. The second trend I expect to see over the next several years is a continued sort of decoupling of the private market investment scene in AI. So this chart shows the percentage of all investment transactions into US-based AI companies that had a Chinese investor participating. And we see that 2015, when we start our analysis, it's a minority, but somewhat sizable. And by the end of this period, we're closer to about 2%. Both by disclosed value and by deal count. Why is this? There's a lot of reasons. Structurally, investors are more likely to invest in their home countries to begin with. Proximity, just familiarity, presence of business networks. In the US, obviously, there's a greatly increased scrutiny in the last few years on investments involving Chinese investors through the CFIUS process and otherwise. And in China, new domestic restrictions on outbound investment that have really cooled sort of the flow of Chinese capital into potentially profitable opportunities overseas. But whatever the reason, this trend is clear. I should also note that it's not reflected on this slide, but we also examined which sorts of deals tend to involve Chinese investors more frequently. Are they mostly investing in life sciences or something else? And again, we don't see clear trends there, right? We don't find a lot of evidence that disclosed Chinese investors are seeking out especially sensitive companies when they invest outside China. Again, these are aggregate trends. Our data are not perfect. And I'm glad to dive into the nuts and bolts of that in the Q&A. But after validation, we're fairly confident these results are meaningful. And just on the sheer numbers, many multiples of these trends might not be enough to change our underlying findings. So as far as we can tell, Chinese investors and any bad actors among them are a relatively small piece of a much larger and more diverse AI investment market in the United States. So finally, implications. In our last few minutes, I want to talk about at least my interpretation of what we would do based on the findings that we have on private market AI investment in the US. I'm going to start with the basics. Don't panic. Don't panic about China in particular. We especially don't have to panic if we're working with our allies and if we're strengthening links, increasing coordination between the private sector and public sector needs. And fourth, I think we should really be thinking about consolidating our advantages other than investment and sort of the US's capital markets, right? That might be a little bit against interest as someone who studies investment and tries to get people to attend webinars about it. But I think we need to think hard about doubling down on AI relevant advantages that money can't buy. And I'll talk a little more about what I mean by that in a moment. So first, don't panic. Going back to our initial counts, the US has a lead. There's no good reason we can't keep it. China faces a lot of the same investment challenges that we do in the US, and many that we don't, honestly, from just their system and sort of the less mature private capital markets and so forth. Overall, there's not a consistent trend in China's favor, right? We still see value counts favoring the US. We see deal counts, China putting up better numbers, but from a very small base. This, private market investment is only one aspect of the overall competition for AI leadership, but it's a really important one. China is a very serious competitor in AI, no doubt, and it's made massive gains, but they're easy to oversell. I don't mean to pick on this particular article. There's a lot like them, but we often see, for example, analyses of the state of play in AI using data from the peak of that cycle, that investment cycle in China. Recall those normalized peaks in 2017, and using that peak and those high investment numbers as key evidence in arguing that the US is being outstripped by China. If you look at the data we've shown and the longer trends, you'll get a different picture. Also, you can get this fairly quickly if you look at Chinese language sources. This is, again, just one that's fairly representative, an anonymous financial official talking about how in China, it's national strategic injury this, emerging industry that, and that's been the case with AI and behind that peak we saw in the earlier slides. Third, work with allies. So again, many of the world's AI growth hubs are in nations that share America's interest in a vibrant, open, democracy-friendly AI future. This is the chart I showed before. I've gone ahead and highlighted the US treaty allies. The others on the list, other than China, are countries like Israel, India, Singapore. The AI hubs of the world and the ones experiencing the fastest growth right now by many metrics are in many cases US allies. They're in our corner, and the data couldn't be clearer that they're going to be an important engine of AI development in the years to come. So what can we do? We can take advantage of this, right? We should leverage our allies' rapidly growing domestic AI sectors and their market power to help build a vibrant and democratic future for AI. In investment, as in so many other domains, policymakers should maybe avoid thinking of an AI race that's between the US and China. And this isn't just true in private market investment, in public R&D funding, for example. I've put a paper by my colleague Melissa Flagg on the side there. We can also see that the US and its allies together are doing far more public R&D funding than the US or China or any other country can do individually. The next point is a tougher one. It's a tough nut to crack, but the data couldn't be clearer that there's an opportunity to strengthen coordination, strengthen ties between government needs and the private sector. Again, our finding is that relatively few AI startups seem to be working and raising funds with public sector clients squarely in mind, especially outside China. A larger share of AI companies are building products that could be used by government, but it's not clear whether that's actually going to take place, especially outside China, where the government accounts for so much of that demand side in the AI market. I'm not sure I have great answers to this problem, but the data are clear that it needs attention, and there's the potential for progress. So a couple of my other colleagues, led by Kat Aiken, have put out a really interesting paper lately surveying private sector AI specialists. There's perceptions that the tech industry wants nothing to do with the government. They find that that's just not the case. Many, if not most, of the private sector AI talent that they were able to survey would be open, if not glad, to work with the public sector, if given the opportunity, if those ties were there to take advantage of. And fourth and finally, the US should think hard about consolidating its other advantages. So our numbers show that the US advantage in private market capital for AI is real, but it's certainly not overwhelming. And it's not future-proof. So competitors can buy their way in, as China has to some extent shown over the last several years with a real concerted push from the top down to push capital into this sector. So in this sense, our investment findings, I think, should push policymakers to think beyond AI investment. We have to ask, what are US advantages that are even bigger and more durable than our advantage in private capital raising? What does the US and what its allies have that other countries can't buy? I think there are several of these advantages. Let's consider one example. So this is a chart from a paper by Will Hunt and Remco Zwetsloot at CSET. And it's showing the net inflow-outflow of inventors in electrical engineering. So that bar away on the left is the US. The US is just attracting, relative to other countries, a huge, huge share of the world's sort of innovators and talents in electrical engineering. And it's true across the board in other sectors as well. This is a sort of advantage that can't be bought, right? China is trying with its talent recruitment programs, but they're not actually having that much success, although they're programs to watch. Our advantage in attracting talent, lies in sort of these deep institutional, cultural, historical features of the American system. It's really ours to lose. There are others in this vein. Our higher education system, our position in certain strategic technologies, choke point technologies, especially when you bring our allies into the picture. Our values, our moral leadership when we're at our best, the culture of free inquiry that again plays a huge role in attracting talent and attracting entrepreneurs. In an era where other countries can compete on capital, as our data suggests they're doing, we need to double down on these asymmetric advantages, the ones that money can't buy. So I think that's a good place to wrap up. Again, these are just the points we've already gone over, and I'm really glad to get into any of them or anything else about our investment research in the Q&A shortly. But in the meantime, again, thanks so much for your attention and thanks for your interest in CSET's research.
Thank you, Zach. And I'm sure there'll be a number of questions and comments on your presentation, which covered not only your report on investments, but also a number of insights from other CSET research, which can be found on our website. Sarah gets to exercise the moderator's prerogative and kick off the Q&A herself. In the meantime, if anyone would like to ask a question, please type it in the chat and it'll be read aloud. We may not get to all the questions, but we'll do our best to cover as much ground as possible. Those who are phoning in for this meeting will not be able to ask questions, and we thank you for understanding the technical limitations here. Sarah, take it away, and I'll jump in to assist with the audience Q&A only as needed.
Thank you, Lynn, and thank you, Zachary, for your presentation and more to the point for the work that you've done and that your teammates have done and that the CSET itself has done on a broad range of issues related to AI. I think you very helpfully reminded us at the outset about some of the limitations of the data. This is a difficult research nut to crack. There are real barriers there, and we'll probably want to get into that in a little more detail. Your point about the rest of the world and the global, the set of allies that we have to work with and how to think about this as a collective enterprise going forward, I think is really important and points to policy recommendations that I think are very congenial with the incoming administration. So I think it's very useful to have that data out there. You talk about the decoupling of investment, and I think we'll probably in the Q&A have a little bit of time to ask whether or not A, that's real, whether we really know if it's real, and B, how meaningful it is. So I want to dig in with you on that, but that's not my question. I'm not there yet. The working with allies, the strengthening the private sector, which is really what In-Q-Tel does in its own work. And so if we have a chance, I'll offer some of our own observations and learning to try to flesh out the recommendations that you have helpfully offered. And the Consolidate other advantages, great points. And again, the need to think more broadly than just the private sector investment piece. But before we dive in, the piece that I really wrestle with is not your recommendation, don't panic. Like, I agree, one should not panic. There's no need to panic. But at the same time, I do wonder, given that the report focuses on private sector investment, whether at the outset it's useful to step back a little bit and say, what are the known unknowns about private sector investment? In other words, what's the larger universe within which private investment sits? And especially since, you're coming at this from a national security perspective, help the audience understand how to think about tracking private investment trends in the context of Chinese mega companies that are publicly traded that do an enormous amount of investment, Chinese government investment that is enormous, and China's ability to steer and direct the innovation that's happening around AI toward, as you put it, the national security applications, and the advantages that CivMil fusion provides for them as we think about them as a geopolitical competitor. In light of those things, how meaningful is it to look at the private sector trends? How much of a grain of salt do we have to have if we're thinking from a national security perspective about what we can actually draw from this research? So I'd love to hear, I'm sure this haunted you through your entire year-long project.
Yeah, no, I mean, really good points. And, I think if our report can help sort of get a sense, convey a sense of the limitations of this sort of analysis, meaningful as it may be, we'll be really happy. But for sure, I mean, China's government is sort of operating in AI in a way that, no other country is, whether or not you like it or not, that's the situation. I think our findings point to some reasons to be cautious about interpreting, China's record in the last, 5 years of AI as a record just of success, right, of massive innovation. There are clearly successes, right, and there's clearly capital being deployed, in many cases in a fairly strategic way, and advances in the tech, right. It is, I came to CSET about 2 years ago when we were just starting out, and I feel like I more often, just in the general discourse, then heard the idea that, oh, like China can't innovate, right? Like none of this money is going to go anywhere. America's got the secret sauce or whatever. I hear a little less of that right now, and I think you'd be hard pressed to dispute that in many areas of AI, China's made significant advancements, and the government's role in sort of directing and in some cases pumping up the private sector has played a part in that. I am not sure that leads to the conclusion that the US needs to be imitating China in any meaningful way, right? I think there's serious weaknesses and volatility in the approach to a government-directed AI private sector. I think that there's some questions about how effectively they're able to do that direction, right? They are no more omniscient than we are. And, you saw in AI a couple of years ago. I think there's been a decent amount in the media lately around semiconductors now, just sort of this investment in overcapacity in local and provincial governments using, whatever the central government's next strategic priority is as an opportunity to just sort of cram in a bunch of economic development projects that might not be strategic. And of course, you can see in our numbers the deflation even in this sector of the market. China is playing in some cases a different game from the US in terms of an overall strategy for AI development, but it's not clear to me how successful that'll be in the long term. I'm hesitant to predict too strongly. The AI is full of surprises, and your information goes stale pretty quickly. But I'm not sure we could imitate their model even if we wanted to. But I do think it's incredibly important, even as we're, in many cases, I think we should be sort of doubling down on our sort of openness and our free market, to think what are some, very effective data-driven strategies for parsing out the small but important amount of, whether it's tech transfer, whether it's unfair trade practices and so forth. How can we target those very important, if not, dominant trends in the market, without wrecking the stuff that has made the US sort of the world's innovation hub, and could continue to do so in the future.
Okay, great. Let me pull a couple of strands. There was a comment from Eric Smith, and then a question from Rita Bush about Chinese investment and the difficulties that you talk about in the report of trying to track Chinese investment. And whether or not we're talking about the effects of CFIUS or Chinese restrictions, or whether we're talking about the fact that we're really only looking at that level of general partner identification of Chinese activity and not able to get to the LP side. Help the audience understand how confident you are about masked investment and your ability to really sort of see through that. And what are the challenges you see for the government and for other researchers in trying to shed light on this in the future?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, totally valid points. I think my take on this overall would be that there are a few ways in which our research could either overlook or downplay some of that activity. But at the same time, we have a hard time imagining. I would be very surprised if the sort of activity we may be missing would be large enough to significantly affect our aggregate findings, right?
Mm-hmm.
So we have a couple issues in finding, detecting Chinese investment. One, just not for China, but for everyone else, like often investors aren't disclosed, right? We can only measure Chinese investors' involvement if their involvement is disclosed, and usually for commercial reasons that may not be the case. Omitting publicly traded companies is a big deal. It's a big deal in the US. It's a big deal in China, where if anything, there's been an even greater rush for AI-related companies to list. They wouldn't be in our analysis in the same way. Although I would say we would capture any of the investment they're engaging in or they're receiving prior to the IPO, right? While they were privately traded, and most of these companies have gone public recently if they have. So there's a decent amount of signal there. So there's a few other uncertainties, which again I'm glad to get into the weeds. But our numbers are estimates for sure. I see their value in trying to help calibrate rather than pinpointing exactly what's going on. You would have maybe a very different policy approach if you thought that 50% of the investors in the market were affiliated with China, as opposed to 5 or even 10, 15% if you multiply our estimates several times. In some ways we're talking about different sorts of problems, right? I think there's a very plausible argument that in certain strategic sectors, one suspect transaction is far too many. There's really good work out of C4ADS, for example, their open arms report, which I encourage everyone to look at, looking at how, even 1 or 2 strategic acquisitions can really move the frontier, the technological frontier in China, and, enable some capability like their new railguns, for example. That's a real problem. That's not a problem that our analysis is going to be able to pick up with any specificity. And I think some of the value in our report is suggesting, that may be the better way to approach this in at least some cases, is not thinking, what can we do to the market as a whole to stamp out activity, but can we identify and target?
Yep. I think that's brilliantly put. And you actually use the needle in the haystack analogy for CFIUS. You say it's just going to be very, very hard, but I think that's a really important distinction. We have a question about the EU and their tech transfer restrictions on AI and software. Specifically, do you think that's going to stem the flow of dual use technologies to authoritarians? And can you talk a little bit more about promotion of democracy through AI and what opportunities the West has, and And then I might follow up on that as a way to tie it together to your observations about where China's been pushing national security applications, if
Mhm.
you're not able to fully cover that then. But
Yeah. Yeah,
keep
no,
it
it's not, I'll admit it's not my topic of expertise, EU
fair enough.
policy. I do think, so I would point everyone, there's a really fabulous report by Andrew Imbrie and his colleagues out of CSET, sort of looking at various sort of thematic areas and topics that seem ripe for an alliances approach. So this, this could be something like investment screening, for example. And I think even since Andrew's report has been published, there's been a lot more activity
Progress.
around investment screening. I mean, my sense is that this problem is being taken seriously in Europe, or at least is being appreciated in a way that 1 or 2 years ago even it wasn't. Sort of in parallel, but a little bit behind sort of the strengthening of the CFIUS process in the US. That's obviously not the, investment screening is not the only domain, maybe not even the major domain in which collaboration with allies could secure a different future for AI than one, led by China, if that were to happen. So thinking about R&D policy, for example, going back to the paper by Melissa Flagg and her colleagues that I flagged earlier, together the US and even like a handful of its key allies control a huge share of global R&D funding. You could imagine that funding being directed in some significant part to machine learning approaches, for example, that preserve privacy even while, producing all the functions that we otherwise want from AI, right? It's not the case that AI is like inevitably a technology for authoritarian repression or privacy and secure, what have you. Similarly around AI safety and security, again, like there are many aspects of the technology that concerted investment from countries with democratic values could change the trajectory of what the technology actually looks like and what comes to market in the next 10, 20, 30 years. And again, when you consider that these happen to also be the countries that have, in many cases, the fastest growing AI ecosystems in the world, you could leverage that for those goals.
Right.
So that's another example, but I would urge everyone to read Andrew's report. Andrew and his colleagues, they are more thoughtful on this than me.
It's just a really interesting observation that the report makes, that when you look at where the government applications are ahead in terms of China and the US, they do have to do, it would appear from your data, very much with the issues that are most neuralgic in terms of the privacy issues, right? They have to do with the sense time equivalent. They have to do with the smart cities surveillance systems, right? So it is possible that one of the challenges the West has is that we haven't come to full agreement between Europe and the US, even within the US, about what constitutes those proper safeguards to put in the technology. But if we fail to reach those decisions and build the tech that realizes those standards, we're ceding the entire global market, which has very real needs for city management, for security support, for all the rest of it. We're ceding that tech to algorithms that come out of China and data that may be returning there. So it's a really interesting combination of your point about democracies banding together and thinking about what it is that they want to do to preserve their values, and the ways in which we seem to be lagging behind the Chinese government's realization of its national security tech needs. Very interesting interrelationship there. So a broad comment again, on CivMil fusion and how you see that relating to AI development, and this probably gets to applications. Can you talk a little bit about what in your research you thought was most important in that regard?
Yeah. So this is actually an ongoing line of research at CSET, and that we've had a couple more papers come out even since this one was written, thinking about, to the extent there is integration, and there is, what does it look like? What gaps are in there? There are some government needs related to AI that I think may be decently well served by big tech, for example, or by the defense contractors that are already. I mean, in some cases, there are government needs that smaller companies are just not well equipped to handle. I think like cloud infrastructure is a pretty good example, and obviously like a crucial enabler for AI. When I'm thinking about, what might be missing from CivMil fusion or just public needs in general for AI, I worry a little more about sort of specialty applications, about tools tailored to particular government needs that may not overlap much with consumer applications. This is really, I mean, in many cases, for example, like government needs are just for reliability, for explainability, assurance, are just dramatically higher than they would be in the private sector, right? So if you're developing an app that markets, shirts to people, if you get that wrong is one thing. If you like mistarget someone and kill them by accident because your AI was hacked or because it just wasn't trained on the analogous data, right? You've got a different problem. So the government standards are very significant and not something that, any private sector AI company is going to be equipped to meet. I think two other quick things. I mean, in some cases, it could be that defense contractors or the big companies or whoever else are providing for the government already, again, in a way that our data wouldn't neatly pick up because we deliberately omit some of those companies. But if there were a lot of competition from other companies, if there were more open contracting, we could see those same products and services just being developed cheaper or better. And then in some sense, we don't really know what could be, right? If government has a lot of unique problems. If there were a cleaner interface, less friction between the government and startups, for example, we could see startups articulating and solving needs for the government that maybe the government didn't even know it had. This is something we're very used to in the consumer sector, right? Like the gadgets we get, we didn't know we need before we needed them. So, it's hard to pinpoint exactly what's missing there, but it's a dynamic that we don't see as much for government and, who knows what could be.
Yep, no, it's really true. And in our work, I mean, one of the biggest challenges is getting the government to articulate a problem as opposed to specify requirements, and then to share the data that, especially in the AI space, the data that's needed in order for companies to begin to actually tailor their products to government needs. And one of the things that we find most helpful is doing analogs, and that is a bit of a stretch for both companies and for government in terms of trying to think about what are the analogous uses as opposed to the direct uses. But those are all things that can be helpful in trying to avoid sieve-meal fusion, but nonetheless get some of the efficiencies that we'd like to between government and the private sector. So we've got a couple of interesting questions about the private sector side of things. How did you think about the nationality of the big US-based tech companies? And which countries did you find, if any, if you looked at profitability, if you looked at ROI, were any countries sort of smarter in terms of their returns on their AI investments?
That's a really good question. We did not, so we didn't examine returns. We didn't examine the performance of any of these investments. We should. I think in terms of the nationality of the larger companies, so one ancillary benefit of focusing on the private market is that you get fewer of these companies that are just operating all over the world. It's a little, again, we're focusing on a segment of the overall investment space that is limited, but is more possible to sort of meaningfully analyze, right? And I don't have a good answer to the question of, what nationality is Google or Siemens, in Europe, or even some of the Chinese companies that are operating very internationally at this point. We took an approach to defining nationality that is relatively simple, leaves some things out, but can be implemented. So we're looking at headquarters location. And I think there's a good argument that, the place where a country is headquartered, is where they're going to have the most natural ties, subject to the most regulatory requirements, which shapes sort of what they're doing with their technology, where they're drawing talent from. But there's absolutely no denying that, AI is, within companies or just in general, like a completely multinational endeavor. We'll have some research coming out actually looking at sort of research labs and hubs being developed overseas by the big tech players and sort of tracking that spread, trying to understand the roots behind it. One interesting sort of preliminary finding there is that, I came back to sort of human talent and capital at the end of the presentation. As far as we can tell, that's a major, or maybe the major factor in sort of this multinational expansion. Market access is very important, but often you'll find accounts of companies saying, we need engineering talent. We can't necessarily bring them all to the US, especially nowadays with issues with immigration law. we're going to set up our research lab in India or like next to Cambridge University in the UK, or for example, and be able to draw that resource that way.
Great. Let me combine a couple more questions for you. And again, feel free to let us and those who are asking the questions know if it's not quite your area and you don't want to take it. It's totally fine. But there's a question about whether you looked at the breakdown of foreign direct investment on specific technologies or on AI ML paradigms. I'm not even quite sure what that means, but you might. And then a related question, do you know to what extent the investment is related to the trends in AI ML R&D or other forms of AI ML innovation? So people trying to understand the relationship between developments in the field and the investment trends. Can you comment on that?
So on the first question, so analyzing sort of, and we articulate it in terms of the application area that the AI is meant to serve. I mean, realistically, I think that, the vast majority of the investments we're looking at are into companies that are using, machine learning, the currently dominant paradigm. In many cases, probably using, off-the-shelf tools, but trying to build a business case for it. In some ways, we're picking up. More sort of general, possibly more fundamental technology. And I think the place to find that would be, we have sort of a general purpose technology category that would weed out any of the really applied stuff. And in that category, you'll see more focus on hardware, for example. You'll see more focus on lower level frameworks for, neural network algorithms and so forth. In terms of the relation between R&D and especially public R&D and the numbers we see, it's pretty unclear to me. So I think, again, startups are not necessarily spending a ton of money on R&D. And I think especially in AI, there's an interesting sort of trend where a huge amount of the fundamental work, the sort of fundamental work that might have been funded by a military lab or a government grant in the past, a huge amount of this is just taking place within Google, within Amazon, and so forth. Truly theoretical advances of the sort that, we assumed maybe to some extent the private sector was going to be less invested in pursuing. Now, it's certainly the case most of their R&D is applied, but government R&D funding and just sort of basic research R&D funding in general would show up outside the data set we're looking at, outside these sort of startup, go to market, go to solve this really concrete problem sort of strategy. And again, there's, that sort of activity that we're capturing is meaningful for national security in some ways, not necessarily in others, right?
Right. Well, we have some more questions, so I'm going to keep going. People obviously can feel free to drop off if they need to, but I would love to get your take on some of these other terrific questions that we have from participants here. So here's one. The trends from Israel and China are in stark contrast. Can you comment as to the key differences in how the two cases might be fundamentally different in what they're doing under the AI banner?
So it's interesting because in important respects, Israel has been an explicit model for China. So specifically, the Chinese sort of government guidance fund model, which is going to be the subject of a really good paper coming out by Nor Luong at CSET, is explicitly modeled on the YOSMA program in Israel, which sort of helped cultivate their AI sector. I think Israel has a few pretty unique advantages in sort of becoming an AI entrepreneurship superpower. In addition to that legacy of government support, you have an unusually sort of military civil fused society in some way. You have, not just in AI, obviously, but cybersecurity, another really good example. People building just huge amounts of really unique operational experience in these technologies, and then bringing it into the private sector and specializing. Also, a very strong and long-standing fundamental research base. One of the biggest AI-related deals in the last year or two has been Intel's acquisition of Habana Labs, which is an Israel-based sort of hardware developer for AI. And that's the kind of market that China is trying to muscle its way into, right? Developing their university system, recruiting engineers where they can, putting just, hundreds of millions, billions of dollars of government money into capital investments for semiconductor manufacturing. But those sorts of industries require a lot of know-how and a lot of specialized expertise that are hard to just buy. And I think in that sense, Israel, has these sorts of unique resources that are accelerating their growth now, for sure.
There's a question here about the potential for integrating human rights due diligence into AI investment decisions. Is there an appetite for this, given that the private sector doesn't consider themselves to be developing public impact technologies?
Yeah, so I think this is, it's plausible. I mean, just speaking as kind of a layperson on this issue, right? We see a dynamic, especially in big tech, where employee pressure employee pressure, and I mean investor pressure, activist investors, for example, can materially shape a company's decisions to be in a certain line of work, to be working for a particular client, and so forth. We've seen it recently with facial recognition. That affects sort of the sorts of trends we're looking at, because so we're counting mergers and acquisitions activity. We're counting, Apple buying up a lot of companies in the facial recognition space, hypothetically, for example. I could, in theory, that to me could be sort of a vector of activism or human rights pressure on these companies. I would say some problems with that approach would be, one, that a lot of this is relatively opaque. It might not be regulated, and there might not be the same levers, in a public sense for action. But I think that the broader point stands that, especially in the US and Western Europe, where the mergers and acquisition markets are relatively well developed, big tech companies that are subject to public pressure to some degree are a huge engine of the investment ecosystem, affecting not only the merger numbers, but also, startup activity, because a lot of times startups are able to raise money because eventually someone thinks they're going to be bought by a big company and they'll get their money back.
We've got a couple questions on the US side. So one is, what positive impacts do you see for AI on the US posture with recent consolidation of hardware companies who are supplying so much edge compute? And then a related one, maybe not so related, but same genre, is what makes particular companies' penetration into the club of incumbents possible? And they cite the example of Palantir. How do you start how do you facilitate the merger of the cutting edge small startup into the big government contracting space?
Both really good questions. Both a little outside my area. On the first point, well, let me start with the second point, actually. So in terms of breaking into government contracting, for example, as a small company, I think it's really hard. When we talk to venture capitalists, they tell us it's really hard. I think the main ways that happens are sort of getting bought up by a defense contractor, or defense contractors just hiring that sort of talent directly. But it's a tough nut to crack. I'm not sure that's exactly getting at the question. And I'm afraid I've lost the first one. Can you remind me of the first question?
Sure. Well, the first one was more about hardware consolidation and what that meant for edge compute.
So I think, I don't know too much about edge computing specifically. On the relation between the sorts of trends that we're tracking in this paper and hardware consolidation in general, and what it means for the US strategy, I would actually say that the findings in our paper I would not stake, America or the West's, currently dominant position in a lot of AI relevant semiconductors on our private investment markets, right? Because this is a sector that China, and China is the player here. China has made clear its intent to, as a country, to develop this technology. And if there's one thing the Chinese government can do, it can push a lot of money at a problem, right? I think that to the extent there are issues in the semiconductor market developing, and the competition from China is one of them, I would expect them to be addressed more through multilateral action around export controls, for example, targeted sanctions and that sort of thing, than through any investment-focused strategy, just because I don't think money is going to be the determinant there.
Well, that is another question that we had, which is, help us understand what's driving Chinese investment in US-based AI. And a related question is, and I think you got to this, but if the aggregate's not the problem, isn't it the specific that's the problem, and how do we ward against that? So a reprise to some extent on a topic you've already covered, but people have questions.
So what are Chinese investors and objectives in the US is of course the key question, even now when there's relatively few. I couldn't answer in every case. I think there is, especially in policy circles, well, no, there's misunderstanding in a couple directions. I think people in policy often think, if Chinese investors are active in the US, there must be a national strategic reason. I think that's sometimes the case. A lot of times it's just the US is where the action is, and Chinese investors want to make money the same way as other people do. That's not to say there's no risk associated with that financially motivated activity, but I think the motivations are often financial. There's plenty of capital in China looking to expand. I don't want to speculate on, I think there's around semiconductors, for example, around narrowly targeting bad actors on the market. There's better work from my colleagues on at CSET. I think one capability that's really important here when we're talking about how to get to a place where we can reliably ferret out, a small number of bad actors. CSET is an entirely open source shop. We buy data, we invest in data analysis capabilities. Private market investment is one situation in which, like, it's not like if you have a government intelligence agency, or you have access to classified resources, you're not necessarily going to get that much juice out of it in this very important sphere of geopolitical competition. And so we've done some work suggesting how the US can build a much better open source intelligence capacity for issues around technological competition. I think private market investment and financial investment in general is just a perfect case for that sort of capacity. And part of the reason we wanted to do the research we're doing now is to model, these are the approaches that, we can do them. Government happens to have a lot of resources that they can be using to do similar work too. And you can drive insight. You can really meaningfully inform whether it's CFIUS or whether it's something else with that sort of analysis.
That's great. Well, I have one. I think we're just not going to get through everything, but I do want to end with a big question from Emily Fan, which is, what is the best case scenario and the worst case scenario for China and the US with respect to AI development? So a big, broad picture question for you to end on.
Yeah, that's broad, but very important. I think I'll narrow it a little bit to investment, and then maybe throw in some thoughts at the end. There's, I think, a race dynamic in which countries are motivated by fear of the other, and I'm thinking more about the US in this case. A dynamic in which the US and China become very, very starkly decoupled, and fear of what China is doing with AI pushes the US to cut similar corners, makes sort of reckless interventions in its own investment market, for example, or make trade-offs on things like privacy or safety in AI. That, in my mind, would be a really bad outcome and a very avoidable outcome from the US-China sort of dynamic. I think there's a reassessment ongoing of China's practices, not just in AI, but in technological competition in general, and a lot of that is well overdue. But the US has far more, I won't say far more, there are very significant risks in our reaction to this challenge. And we see that, in investment. I'm not sure investment is the most significant place in which I'd expect to see those ramifications, but you could certainly, for example, if people have their hair on fire about Chinese investors implementing some, very sweeping capital controls or investment screening that kind of makes life much harder across the board for startups and sort of diminishes that engine of US AI productivity. I think this is a very salient issue in talent, for example. There's big differences, and CSET's worked a lot on this. There's big differences between an immigration policy for science and tech and entrepreneurs that understands there's a significant but relatively small number of people we should be concerned about coming into the US, versus one that is sort of painting with a broad brush and really stifling private sector activity. There's if you go online, you'll see people working in the most innovative labs in the private sector talking openly about how like immigration constraints or other aspects of sort of the set of policies we brought to bear on China are just sort of wrecking their research productivity, right? Forcing them to expand their operations into other countries just to be able to get the sort of talent they need, which is not really serving the US's security any more than if they were here. So I'm not sure if that's the worst case, best case scenario, but I think, what sort of future we can expect will turn a lot on how we choose to react to the challenge from China. And it's not foreordained how we should do that.
Great. Well, your report certainly gives us a sense of how what you describe as the slice of private investment should not set our hair on fire, but that it's part of a larger ecosystem of both understanding private sector trends in AI, but understanding the different dimensions of geopolitical competition as they relate to AI. And thank you for adding such an important piece to the puzzle and for giving us all so much to think about, Zach. This has been really great. Thank you.
Oh no, it's my privilege and all of ours at CSET. And thanks, Sarah, for joining the conversation about this. I really appreciate it.
And on behalf of CSET, I'd like to thank our colleague and featured speaker, Zach Arnold, along with moderator, Dr. Sarah Sewell. Many thanks as well to all of you for attending today and for your thought-provoking questions. Once again, Zach's report is linked on CSET's website in the page corresponding to this event, as well as on our research page of the website, where you'll find the several other reports to which Zach referred that were authored by our colleagues. We'll also place the report link in our follow-up email tomorrow for those who registered for this webinar. And we will soon share news of our next event. In the meantime, CSET wishes you a meaningful holiday season. Stay safe, and we hope to see you again, if only virtually, real soon.